Nice to see some new people here as well. We have a lot to cover today. I kind of asked Diego where I should take this for new people or more experienced people, and I think there's a little bit for everything. You know, in the past we've always treated fruit trees as crops, and if you look at pruning on fruit trees, most of the books haven't changed in the past 50 to 70 years. They butchered the trees, they pruned them badly, and why? Because they're a crop. And crops are replaceable, and after we prune them badly and they die off, we simply replant them. Well, a lot of the damage we do to our trees is done by our pruning. As an arborist, we've really changed the way we prune trees in the past 20 years. There are some excellent people.
Don't go away. That was a word.
We did it live.
Eventually. Don't be concerned about taking notes. This on the handouts you have, which kind of an outline of this. On the back of the page, there's also not only my phone number, but a website for the San Diego chapter. And under presentations on the website, you'll see this presentation, as well as many others that I've created and made for classes that I've taught. So everything that you see tonight is on that website. You can revisit it. You can get additional information. I'm going to go rather quickly, as this is a fairly long topic. Obviously, pruning fruit trees is pretty involved. How many of you have heard peach trees are short-lived? The average lifespan of a peach is about 15 years. Is that about right? Is that what you read?
Yes.
Yeah. Is that what you hear?
Yes.
Yeah. Why does that only live 15 years?
Don't know.
Because of the bad pruning practices we do. That creates disease, that creates decay, that causes the tree to have structural failures and dies. A good, healthy peach tree should remain productive for about 40 to 50 years. But it's a lot cheaper and it's a lot easier to prune badly and simply replace the trees.
But they don't tolerate really cold winters very well, though, do they?
Well, we don't get really cold winters here in San Diego, so we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
But, you know, how cold will they take? You know, down in the 10, 15 degrees, not much problem. These two names you see on the slide in front of you, Alex Shigo and Richard Harris, are probably the two most noted names in pruning of trees in the arboricultural industry today. They have really changed how we understand plants and the way they heal and the damage we do when we prune trees and how we can perform better pruning practices, keep our trees healthy and strong, and give them a much longer life. If you'd like to learn more about pruning trees, you're going to find many books out there that are standards in the industry by Alex Shigo and Richard Harris. Unfortunately, none of them address fruit trees. Why? Because fruit trees are a crop. They're not a valued part of our landscape. I actually met Alex Shigo's daughter, and this was a sore point for him for 25 years, up until the time of his death. He was always arguing we should not prune fruit trees the way we do, but we do. And unfortunately, we do a lot of damage to them. Keep in mind that pruning wounds are wounds forever. Whenever you prune a tree, you are going to wound it. Whenever you prune a plant, you're going to wound it. And that damage never heals. We talk about plants healing, that's a misnomer. They seal the wound, they never heal the wound. And a wound is a wound forever. Unlike animals where tissues grow back together, plants never grow back over a damaged area. Instead, they compartmentalize the wound, sealing it off, covering it up both externally and internally in an effort to try to prevent decaying disease organisms from traveling into the heartwood of the tree, which ultimately leads to their structural failure and death. Your job as a pruner is to minimize the damage you do when you prune your fruit trees and to facilitate this wound response, which helps to compartmentalize the wound, and the faster this occurs, the less likely the decay and disease will travel into the heart of the tree. It's always better to make small cuts rather than large cuts, and this means pruning on your tree should begin at an early age. Usually we do not recommend pruning fruit trees for the first year after planting. Unless the branches are damaged or broken, it's better not to prune. I bet every one of you have gone into a nursery, bought a fruit tree, and what's the first thing the nursery wants to do when they hand you the tree? They cut it down to 30 inches from the ground. Why? Because that's what they tell you to do, right? That's bad. That's bad. That's adding insult to injury. Think about that a moment. When a tree loses its leaves, it stores its food in the roots. So these deciduous trees, which are sold as bare root, are grown in a field, and we come along and we rip them out of the ground and we cut most of the roots off. Okay. So now it doesn't have any roots to pick up water and nutrients, and most of the food reserves have been taken away by our pruning when we dug it out of the ground. Now the only way that tree can recover is to produce more food. How does it produce more food? It produces food through the leaves. And what do? We cut it down to 30 inches so it doesn't have any branches with leaves anymore. Now it has to grow new leaves, has to grow new branches, has to grow new roots. We're just stressing our trees, and that wound that we do takes much longer to heal. Pruning seals are not good. For decades we were told if you make a pruning cut larger than 1 inch in diameter, use a pruning seal on it. Bad. It does no good. It's purely cosmetic. At best, it covers up the wound so we don't see it. At worst, it encourages decay and disease organisms. It doesn't do any good at all. Don't use them unless you're going to seal the inside of a pot to make the pot waterproof. That's the only thing pruning seals are good for. You can still buy them. They still sell them. People will still sell them to you. They're not beneficial. There are 3 basic types of cuts, and the first is called a heading or topping cut. This type of cut promotes excessive sprouting from below the pruned area or wounded area. It's a cut made indiscriminately without regard to branch attachment, and the response is to send up many, many shoots that have a great deal of vigor and are excessively crowded and poorly attached. Heading cuts are only beneficial if you're making a hedge. You'll hear a lot of times, people will tell you, books will tell you, cut the top third of your tree off. Oh, that's how you keep it small. No, you don't. When you prune the top of your tree off, what's the response? Is the tree sends up these tall, vigorous shoots that grow straight for the sky, and within 6 months it's taller than it was before. Now instead of having one top, it has many tops that are poorly attached, easily break off, overly crowded. You get an excessive amount of fruit if it's fruit bearing. You get problems with fungus diseases like botrytis. Topping or heading cuts are great when you're making a hedge, but not great when you're pruning fruit trees. This is the response of your topping or heading on the right over here. On your fruit tree, that's an apricot that was topped. Person wanted to keep it small, prune the top of the tree off down to 8 feet. 6 months later, that's what it looked like. Now instead of one top, you have 50 tops. They're so crowded that there's no fruit wood being formed. You have 10 times the number of branches to prune, and those branches that are not pruned are weak and poorly attached and will fall off. Structurally, this is a disaster. Topping is a bad word. You should not top or head your trees. This is what you see on the right, top right. That's a mulberry tree. The only time you top trees is if you're creating what's known as a pollard. This is a pruning style they use in Europe. It was a practice for generating firewood. Because when you top your tree in the top right corner and the bottom right corner, that's what you see 6 months later. Lots of nice firewood to keep you warm through the wintertime. On a fruit tree, that's bad, bad news. The pruning techniques you should use on your fruit trees are what are known as thinning cuts. Thinning cuts are cuts that remove entire branches at the point of origin or a portion of a branch back to a lateral. These types of pruning cuts do not result in excessive branching and vigorous growth and maintain an apical growing point that suppresses the lower branches. A specialized type of pruning called drop crotch pruning is a technique that's used for size control. So people will often ask, well, how do I keep my tree small if I don't top it? You use the technique known as drop crotch pruning. This pruning technique prunes back to a branch that's at least 1/3 the diameter of the branch you're removing. It maintains an apical growing point. It facilitates rapid wound closure and compartmentalization, and it maintains the original shape of the tree. A well-pruned tree looks like a person that got a really good haircut. You can hardly tell they got a haircut. As opposed to Mo up there with his bowl cut, which is what we do when we prune our trees badly. Here you see a technique, the drop crotch pruning technique, where the tallest or furthest extending branch is cut back into a lateral limb and pruned at the top of the collar or the shoulder of the branch. The last page in your handout is titled Natural Target Pruning. This is a guideline on how to prune so that you facilitate rapid wound closure and compartmentalization of that wound. There are targets that we look for when making proper pruning cuts. The most important is the branch collar or shoulder and the branch bark ridge.
Can you go back? What's the difference between those two? I was trying to figure out what's wrong. It says improper. What's improper?
On this improper cut, this cut was made too deep. The bottom of the cut is below the point of attachment of the branch you're removing. So this limb is now only attached to half of a structural limb. And this is very weak. Also, you're pruning off an area that helps to compartmentalize that wound, where this is pruned higher up. The bottom of the cut is actually straight across from the point of attachment.
Okay.
And so this limb is attached to a full structural branch,
Okay.
not a half of a branch. On the top right corner, you can see the branch collar. This is one of the most important areas when pruning. You never want to damage this collar or shoulder of the branch. This is the area which generates callus tissue that helps to compartmentalize the wound externally. It also triggers a wound response, which builds up tissues of greater resistance to decay internally when you prune at the top of the collar. Wound responses are the way plants compartmentalize the wound and helps to prevent decay and disease from traveling down into the heartwood of the tree, compromising the structural integrity. It is.
I'm sorry. Could you explain what A, B, and C were there?
A, B, and C, this is, we'll talk about that a little more in just a moment. This is when we're making a three-part pruning cut. If you're pruning off a very large limb or a heavy limb, you don't want to make it your pruning cut in a single cut, which will end up ripping or tearing the bark as it falls away. So when you're pruning a larger limb, you prune it with a 3-part pruning cut that helps prevent the bark from tearing. The first cut is made as an undercut away from the collar or shoulder of the branch, about 1/3 of the way through the branch. The second cut is made further out on the branch from the top and cut through until this branch falls away and breaks at your first cut. The last cut is made at the top of the collar or shoulder of the branch.
Well, you just say you only go down partially? You don't cut all the way through?
On the first cut, only partial.
Oh, okay.
When you are pruning with hand pruners or loppers, pay attention to how you orient these pruners, especially with bypass loppers, which are actually our pruners. Bypass are your best pruning tools. It is important on how you hold them, however. You want the cutting blade positioned at the top of the collar or shoulder so that your cut is at the top of the collar and does not leave a stub. If you reverse your pruner so that the anvil portion of the bypass pruners is against the shoulder, you'll end up leaving a stub, and stubs do not trigger the wound response. When you leave a stub, that stub remains an open point of infection for decay and disease indefinitely. You'll never see callus tissue form, and it does not heal over the wound. It does not compartmentalize internally, so decay and disease can travel down into the whole body of the tree. Stubs are very bad. In making proper pruning cuts, the correct cut is at the top of the collar or shoulder of the branch, never cutting into this tissue, never removing the shoulder or collar. You do not want to make flush cuts. Some books in the past have said make flush cuts or make your cuts flush with the branch it's attached to. When you do this, you cut off the collar shoulder of the branch, which helps to compartmentalize the wound. You also make a much larger wound than you need to, and that takes longer to compartmentalize and seal. You do not want to leave stubs. Again, stubs never compartmentalize. And on the bottom, you can see the result of not making a 3-part pruning cut when pruning large limbs. So in pruning larger limbs or heavy limbs that are too heavy to support, always make a 3-part pruning cut. There are some rules for making proper pruning cuts. You do not see a collar or shoulder. Your target is the branch bark ridge. Luckily, most of our fruit trees have visible shoulders or collars, but there are rules for pruning using the branch bark ridge as a visual indicator of where to make a proper pruning cut. We're going to talk about this in just a moment. Notice the narrow crotch angle on these branches. This is very bad for structural strength. When you have narrow crotch angles of less than 30 degrees, a condition will occur called included bark that will result in the branch splitting right down the V of those branches. Whenever you have 2 limbs or 2 leaders coming out of the same point with less than a 30-degree angle, you need to remove one of them to prevent this splitting from occurring. I really want to urge you to consider doing more training on your fruit trees than traditional pruning practices have taught us to do. Training is a great option for directing branches to develop correct shapes without making the wounds associated with pruning. If you have a tree, traditionally we've said, well, you prune it and you develop branches growing in the right direction. When you prune it, you just cut off the time it took to grow those branches and you made a wound that takes time to heal over, and you remove leaf material that helps to produce food for the plant. And a lot of times, especially on young trees, you can achieve the same results by taking the branches while they're still young and pliable and directing them into position. Spread them out. If we have a tree that we need a branch over here and it doesn't have any, take a branch and tie it over there. Bend it, manipulate it, hold it in place with a stake or with a guide wire for 6 months, and now you have a branch where you needed a branch. A lot of times I'll work with people who have a young stone fruit and it has a central leader. And I tell them, okay, this needs to be pruned into an open vase shape. And they say, well, how do I make it into an open vase shape without cutting the central leader out? And I tie the central leader over this direction, and I take one of the branches and pull it over this direction, and guess what we have? An open vase shape. And no pruning wounds were made. Training is a great option, and definitely a usable tool that will prevent the wounds associated with pruning. Whenever you do train branches, it is important that the material you use, which comes in contact with the bark of the tree, is at least 1 inch wide. This is to distribute the pressure on the bark so that we do not damage the bark. In the old days, we used to take a rope or a wire and run it through a garden hose, and that does nothing in terms of distributing the pressure. It's been found that it's really, again, cosmetic and really doesn't help. Any material that comes in contact with the bark should be at least 1 inch wide. What can you use? Anything you want. Old inner tubes, old tires, old pantyhose, old socks, old strips of cloth, webbing from lawn chairs, nylon webbing that you get in the hardware store, green nursery tape, it doesn't matter. As long as it's 1 inch wide, it can be 4 inches wide if you want, but at least 1 inch wide. Here you can see slings that were used tied around the branch, and then a rope was tied to the sling. This way the pressure is distributed evenly across the surface of that branch, and we don't damage the bark. You can use spreaders as well on the double notch stick you see on the right bottom corner. That works fine too. Anything really works. Just distribute the pressure on the tree. A lot of classes I teach on fruit tree pruning, I'll ask the class, well, what's the #1 reason for pruning fruit trees? And the answer comes back to get fruit. No. Because we have to be concerned with the weight load of that crop of fruit on our fruit trees, which can be quite significant, hundreds of pounds at times. We really have to be more concerned with developing a good, strong framework of our tree first and foremost. What good does it do to have a heavy crop of fruit on a tree where the branches split and fall off before you get your fruit, and now you have a damaged tree? So structural pruning is your #1 reason for pruning, structural strength. There are some rules for structural pruning. Spacing the branches evenly up the trunk of the tree so that there is internode space between branches is one of the most important steps in developing good structural strength. In the old days, when we cut the tree at 30 inches from the top, what happens? All these branches come off right from that top of that cut area. There's no internode distance. Those branches are very weak structurally. They split off many years down the road, and there's no way to repair that. Once that damage is done, it's done. And it can lead to the ultimate failure of the tree. Properly pruned and properly trained, a tree has scaffold branches moving vertically up the trunk and radially around the trunk, like a spiral staircase. The first one here, the second one here, the third one here, the fourth one here, and up and around the tree like a spiral staircase. This is developed best on young trees. As our trees get older, or if we have an older tree that we're working with, we may not be able to correct this. So we have to work with what we have. But if you have the opportunity to train good structural scaffold branching, it'll pay off in the long run for a much longer lived tree. As I alluded to, any branches that have less than a 30-degree angle between the branch and the trunk, or the two branches, we need to either spread or cut off one of these branches. As branches have less than a 30-degree angle, the bark becomes sandwiched between the two limbs and will cause splitting and structural failure, which again causes irreparable damage to the tree. It may split right down the trunk, at which time people want to put a wound dressing on it, and that does nothing. People will ask, well, what can I do? And the answer is nothing. There's nothing you can do. When you have codominant limbs, codominant branches, pick one and remove it. If you cannot spread it, sometimes you can spread it out and open up that crotch angle, but if it's too thick or too stiff, you will need to remove one. Which one really doesn't matter. Here we can see a perfect example of included bark. You'll see this out in the field everywhere where the bark is sandwiched inward. Where two limbs come together, the bark should be pushed outward. If you see it sandwiched inward, that is called included bark, and this is not grown together at all. The only point of attachment of this limb is down here. So as these two branches get heavy with a crop of fruit, or weight load of the branch and we get wind blowing through, this is going to split right down the center of the tree. Also for structural strength, especially on fruit trees, it is highly advisable to remove branches which come off the bottoms of branches. Now this is significant for larger limbs. They're small fruiting limbs, fairly small limbs. We don't have to worry about it so much. But as the limbs get larger, this large limb, which comes off the bottom of its supporting limb, will rip away and tear off the underside of the supporting limb. Bottom branches should be removed for structural strength. As well as pruning for strength, we also have to prune for health. And in pruning for health, we remove the 4 Ds. What are the 4 Ds? Dead, damaged, diseased, and dysfunctional branches. People will often say, well, what's a dysfunctional branch? And the answer to that is a branch that's growing in the wrong place. It's dysfunctional if it's growing out into a pathway and is going to poke you in the eye when you walk by. It's dysfunctional if it's laying on the ground and all the fruit is eaten by the snails and it's an easy access for ants to get up into your tree. It's dysfunctional if it's rubbing other branches, causing bark damage. That's a branch that's just simply growing in the wrong place. So for health, we remove the 4 Ds: dead, damaged, diseased, and dysfunctional branches. Now we come to the next reason to prune our fruit trees, and this is sometimes variable as far as our function. We can trade around a little bit. First reason to prune is for structural strength. Second reason is to prune is for health. The third depends on what you need. Sometimes it's for fruit production. If we are pruning for fruit production, we have to pay attention to what type of fruiting wood our trees bear fruit on. Some trees bear fruit on new growth. Some trees bear fruit on last season growth. Some trees bear fruit on fruiting spurs. It's important before you go out to your fruit trees and start pruning, you review what fruiting wood you want to preserve to get your crop of fruit on. I had one student in the class come up to me and she was very proud. She says, "Tom, I followed your directions. I went out to my apricot tree and I pruned all those little branches off that were growing on my apricot tree." And I said, "Were they little branches that are about this big and buds were real close together?" "Yeah, I got rid of all that stuff." And I said, "Those were your fruiting spurs on your apricot." And she pruned all of her fruiting wood off. It'll grow back in about 3 years. Oops. This is an example of the different types of fruiting wood that some of the more common fruit trees bear on. So it is important to review that. Some bear on more than one type of wood. Figs bear on both current season growth and last year's growth. Apples can bear on tips and on spurs. Again, this is on the website, so if you go into presentations, it can help you if you're not familiar.
Which website?
Go to the San Diego chapter website. That's on the last page, crfgsandiego.org, and go under presentations. Here's an example of current season fruiting wood and types of plants that you see them fruiting on, things like citrus, avocados, figs. Previous season wood are some of your earliest blooming plants, those fruit trees that bloom first thing in the spring: peaches, nectarines, mulberries, loquats. These all bear on last season wood.
Plums?
Plums? No, prunes are spurs. So not last season wood on a plum. Makes it easy to be able to size control a plum. Fruiting spurs. These are fruiting spurs on apricots. Now we'll talk about how to identify fruiting spurs versus non-fruiting wood. Here's a great example of that. Fruiting spurs on plums, on apricots, on apples are very easy to identify by how close the buds are together. If you look at a fruiting spur on a plum, an apricot, a pluois, an apple, the buds are less than 1/8 of an inch apart. This is a fruiting spur on an apricot. This is a non-fruiting branch. The buds are at least 3/4 of an inch apart. This is going to produce fruiting spurs next year, but this year it produces only leaves. Now, if you're not sure if it's fruiting or non-fruiting and it bears on spurs, pay attention to how far apart your buds are. These are fruiting spurs on plums. Sometimes they look like thorns. Fruiting spurs all the way up a 2-year-old branch. Look how close those buds are together. This is a non-fruiting branch. Here's a bud, here's another bud, here's another bud. Here's a fruiting spur. So this is fruiting, this is non-fruiting this year. Properly pruned, trees that have fruiting spurs are wonderful. This is a well-pruned plum. Fruiting spurs running all the way from the end of the branch down to the main trunk of the tree. All these little silhouettes you see here, that's all fruiting wood all the way down the entire length. Fruiting spurs on apples. Now, apples often don't produce visible buds, but they produce bud scars. These little wrinkles we see are fruiting spurs on our apple. Fruiting spurs. And these are fruiting spurs on pears, looking very similar in the apple. This is fruiting wood on a pear. fruiting spurs on a pear, and here you see it coming into flower. It is important to manage your fruiting wood as the trees get older. Using good pruning techniques, you'll find that as the trees mature, most of your pruning goes into managing the fruiting wood because there's very little sucker growth that develops on a properly pruned tree. That was probably one of the most impressive things to me when I started pruning our orchard at Southwestern College. We had an old orchard there, traditional pruning was used on it, and then we would go out at the end of the year and it would have suckers 12 feet tall filling the center base of the tree. After 10 years of pruning, actually it was after 5 years of pruning, we were able to walk out to the trees and there were no suckers. And most of the pruning was managing of our fruiting wood. A lot of the trees we could walk up to and say, this tree doesn't need to be pruned. It was pretty impressive.
Do you get fruit in multiple years from the same spot?
On fruiting spurs, the fruit will be born on the same spot for multiple years.
How many?
Apricots produce fruiting wood on the same spurs 3 to 5 years. Plums, apples, pears produce fruit on the same spurs for up to 10 years or more. We've learned for best fruit production that we do need to prune trees to specific shapes. Open vase and modified open vase shapes produce the greatest amount of fruit on fruit trees in the genus Prunus. Peach, plum, nectarine, apricot, almond, and cherry, as well as the interspecific hybrids, pluots, abriums, cherry plums, etc. All other trees, which are not in the genus Prunus, should be pruned as central leader or modified central leader shapes. So we prune to an open vase for only our stone fruit. Everything else, central leader, modified central leader. People will say, what about a mango? Central leader, modified central leader. What about a persimmon? Central leader, modified central leader. Fig. On and on. It's not a stone fruit. Central leader, modified central leader. We do also prune trees for function. Sometimes we prune them into shade trees, sometimes we prune them into screens and edges, sometimes we prune them into espaliers. This may override fruit production if we need a specific function. We prune to direct or redirect growth. Sometimes branches get heavy with fruit, and now the branch is growing towards the ground, they're lying on the ground. We need to redirect that back into an upright position. A branch might be growing into a pathway. We need to prune to redirect the growth. Redirection is done with drop crotch pruning techniques. Again, pruning back to a lateral and directing the growth using that that lateral as a dominant leader. That will direct the growth in the direction you want it to grow. And we prune for size. Fruit trees that are pruned to their maximum size will produce the greatest amount of fruit. A 35-foot plum tree, which they will get 35 feet on a standard plum, is going to produce more fruit than a 12-foot plum tree. But who wants to pick fruit out of a 35-foot tree? Try to net a 30-foot tree so the birds don't get it. And pruning a 30-foot tree can be intimidating. So generally, we try to keep our trees to a smaller size to make it easier to pick, easier to prune, easier to spray, easier to protect from birds. Most of your fruit trees can be kept in the range of 10 to 15 feet, pretty easily. If you look at the top pictures, this is an apricot that was hat-wrapped or headed in an effort to keep it small. And the picture on the right shows the excessive amounts of branching that developed that following season. When you do prune, drop back and prune with thinning cuts using the drop crotch pruning technique we talked about earlier. When you prune with drop crotch pruning techniques, you leave the apical growing tips of the lateral branches unpruned, as you see here. This branch was drop crotch pruned, leaving that top branch as our apical leader. Those branches have not been pruned. We keep an apical growing point that suppresses growth beneath the cut, and we prune at the collar or shoulder of the branch to facilitate rapid wound closure. This is a proper pruning to keep the plant small. We prune to manage root suckers. Most fruit trees are grafted, with the exception of figs. Sometimes mulberries are not grafted. Pomegranates are not grafted, but most other fruit trees are. And everything below the graft is a root sucker. These root suckers can sap away energy from the tree and grow to become a dominant branch, suppressing and killing off the graft. We need to remove root suckers. Many times I've seen fruit trees where people say, no, I used to have this wonderful sweet plum or this wonderful sweet orange, and now all I get are these small sour fruit. And you go and you look at the tree, and what happened is a root sucker grew below the graft, grew with more vigor than the graft did, killed off the graft, and now all they have left is rootstock. Very important to pay attention and remove those root suckers.
How do you remove them?
Prune them off.
I mean, you have to dig down?
Yeah, some come like all.
It's best to, any way you can. Any way you can. We also get rid of water sprouts. What's a water sprout? A water sprout is a tall, vigorous branch growing above the graft union. These are water sprouts. This is what a tree that was pruned using traditional methods looked like at the end of the season. Pretty intimidating. Properly pruned, you don't have any of this. Water sprouts used to be said, well, water sprouts are bad because they don't bear fruit. And that's not true. Water sprouts, which are above the graft, will produce the same quality and type of fruit as the rest of the tree. They're juvenile, and so they often do not produce the first year. They have to mature before they produce. They can be directed and trained to become a good structural fruiting branch. So you don't have to remove all water sprouts. But if they are dysfunctional, if they're crowding, if they're rubbing, if they're congesting the tree, then we remove them. It is important to keep timing in mind. What's the proper time to prune your fruit trees? San Diego, I normally recommend starting to prune deciduous fruit trees around Christmas time and prune up until first bud break or so. Once flowers begin to develop and bloom out, you can still prune your tree. And it's better to prune it than not prune it. People say, well, you get sap. Well, sap is fine. Sap is the way the tree is protecting itself from decay and disease organisms as well as insects. And it's better to prune it than not prune it, because if you don't prune it, you're going to have to make much larger pruning cuts the following year, and you may not get any fruit. But ideally, prune your deciduous fruit trees between about Christmas and usually about the middle of February, depending on where you live, depending on the variety. Some fruit trees here in San Diego will sprout out by, I have a couple of fruit trees that are in full bloom by January 15th. Others, not until the end of February, beginning of March.
Desert Delight nectarine?
And there are a number of them.
That was always early for me.
And things like an apple. An apple may never lose its leaves and may never go dormant. So when do you prune it? Around Christmas time, the beginning of February.
Tom, some nurseries are promoting summer pruning.
That's correct, Jim. Thank you. And it says down here, I do recommend light summer pruning that will help to direct branches, will make smaller pruning cuts come winter time, and can help keep a tree smaller. It's important when you summer prune to make small cuts. Be careful with summer pruning. You don't want to expose so much of the tree to direct sunlight that you risk sunburn. And during the summertime, bark beetles or borers are very common, and they are attracted to pruning wounds. So things like shot-hole borer and peach tree borer are very common in our area. If you make large pruning wounds on your fruit trees during the summer when their populations are high, they might attack and kill your tree. Maintain pruning in summer to small cuts, generally finger diameter or so, and much less than during your winter pruning season.
Is the measure to hit fruits on there or not?
Usually summer pruning is done after fruit harvest. Yeah.
I have several multi-grafted trees where there's like 5 varieties on the tree, and I was told that you need to keep them all kind of evenly growing so that one doesn't take over.
That's correct.
How do you do that? What's the best way to do that without causing these problems?
On multi-grafted trees, the comment was made, you need to keep a symmetry between the varieties so that one variety does not dominate and take over the other varieties. And you do that with drop crotch pruning techniques, suppressing the more vigorous varieties by pruning more aggressively and pruning the less vigorous varieties less so that they have a chance to catch up. Unfortunately, the problem with multi-grafted trees is a lot of times the earlier sprouting varieties become dominant, and even your pruning isn't going to suppress that. So they'll ultimately take over the tree in many cases anyway. One reason why a lot of the nurserymen, myself included, advocate multi-plantings versus multi-grafts. On individual rootstocks, the plants can compete better than if they're all competing on the same rootstock.
So you keep pruning them in the summer as well to keep them even?
Yes, you can also prune in the summer to try to keep them even, yes.
Pinch the buds.
You have to prune more continually to keep a balance. I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step here in just a moment. Pruning styles include the open-based or modified open-based pruning styles for stone fruit. Traditionally, we say that these trees need to be pruned 40 to 60% of the tree needs to be pruned away every year. If you follow principles by Shigo and that I advocate, you'll find that you're only having to prune maybe 20% of the tree every year versus 40 to 60%. Pruning into an open base or modified open base takes the growth out of the center of the tree. We do maintain small branches along the scaffolds, which not only brings fruit down into the interior of the tree, but prevents sunburn. Unlike the old days where we removed all of the interior branches, today we maintain small interior branches, keep them pruned low so they don't block the sunlight, get more production, protect the tree from sunburn, and these small interior branches help the limbs to develop caliper or girth, making them stronger than when we prune them all off. It also gives us an option to drop crotch prune. If we have a tree of this size and want to make this limb smaller, there's nothing here. How do you make it smaller? You're going to have to top it. If we have a branch as we see here and we wish to make it smaller, we can come in and drop crotch some of these interior branches, reducing a portion of the limb and maintaining an apical growing point. Modified open vase shapes differ from an open vase in that there are multiple layers, a bowl within a bowl, and sometimes within a bowl. Modified open vase trees are larger than single open vase. A large modified open vase tree may be 25 feet tall. We need to maintain enough space between the first and subsequent layers so that we get incidental light passing between the layers for good fruit production. You can see a double vase on this modified open vase here. And again, maintaining some of these smaller interior branches is beneficial. Large trees can have up to 3 layers on a modified open vase. When I teach pruning, I recommend people follow a step-by-step procedure. After almost 40 years pruning fruit trees, I still prune my trees this way. If you walk out to a large tree, I find a lot of people being intimidated by all the branches there are to prune. And they'll start by pruning a branch over here, and then they'll stand back and they'll think about it, and they'll prune a branch over here, and then they'll stand back and think about it, and then they'll maybe make a pruning cut over there, and then they go in and rest because they're just overwhelmed. If you prune in a systematic fashion, it's much easier to accomplish your goal. It's like the old riddle or joke. How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Take it in small pieces. So I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step that I teach. First step, remove all root suckers. Anything below the graft, those go. Number 1, done. Number 2, open up the center of the tree to get more light and air penetrating into the center of the vase. Don't be concerned with every single branch. Just make your major cuts to remove most of this interior growth. Just come in and anything that's pointing right towards the center of the tree, cut it and remove it. Anything that's going straight up the center of the tree, prune it out and remove it. All the little stuff we'll deal with later. Make your major cuts and open up the center of the tree. Step 2. Step 3. Start with the limb that is closest to the ground and work your way from the trunk to the tip of the branch, following the rules of structural strength, health, and fruit production. Remove bottom limbs. Remove crossing limbs. Remove limbs with narrow crotch angles. Remove dead, damaged, dying, and diseased branches. And space out the remaining limbs so that they're not crossing, they're not touching, they're not rubbing, and we have some space between the branches so that light air can pass to the developing fruit.
How far apart actually?
How far apart is really something that you have to learn. It depends on the tree, depends on the exposure, depends on the crop. There's no hard and fast rule to give you an answer to that. Is it a semi-dwarf? Is it a standard? Is it a north exposure or a south exposure? Is it this tall or is it 20 feet tall? There's no easy answer. Enough to allow good light penetration and air circulation around the plant and to prevent an overproduction of fruit that will break the limb. Here you can see an overgrown branch and one that was now pruned, obviously pruned. So have a lot more fruiting wood remaining than the previous branch. If you're developing multiple layers, anything that grows from the lower layer to the upper layer and crowds, crosses, or congests airflow and light penetration needs to be removed so that we get light and air passing between the layers. After a branch is properly pruned, it often looks like a feather with limbs coming off the sides of the branch, limbs coming off the top of the branch as long as they're not crossing other branches, and perhaps small limbs coming off the bottoms of the branch. This is a limb before it was pruned and after it was pruned. And again, branch before being pruned and after it was being pruned. We can leave small branches coming off the bottom of a limb as long as they're not going to become so heavy that they're going to split away. So small limbs coming off the bottom are fine. As you are developing an open vase shape and working your way out to the end of the branch, imagine these scaffold branches to be like your arms, with limbs coming off the sides of your arm. You don't want anything coming out of the center of your forearm growing to the center of the vase, everything kept down out of the center. And when you get to the end of the branch, this is often referred to as a cup. This smaller outer portion of the branch is like your hand, with all the fruiting wood being your fingers. So we have these nice fruiting woods out here on the end of our outstretched arm. Work your way from the trunk all the way out to the ends of the branch. When we're done with the first branch, now move to the next branch. At this point, we are not looking at the entire tree. We're looking at only the scaffold branch we're working on. Take it from the trunk to the end of the branch and work to the end of that one limb. Ignore the rest of the tree. You'll get to it later. Move your way from the trunk to the end of the branch and only focus on that one limb. Work your way around the tree, usually going from the lowest branch, working your way up the trunk. Here's a tree that was topped or headed. All the branches coming out of the same point. Look at the included bark we have here. Ultimately, what happened to this tree? This limb split off right down the trunk. At that point, there was nothing we could do about it. We tried to lessen the weight load, but unfortunately, that's the ultimate fate of trees like this. Work your way around the tree, working one scaffold branch at a time. When you've worked all your scaffold branches on the first layer, you can move up to the second layer on a multi-vase tree. Tree on the left was before it was pruned, tree on the right was after it was pruned. Remember, with multiple layers, keep enough distance between the first and subsequent layers to allow good air and light penetration. It is only when you are finished that you look at the entire tree again. And at this point, what we are looking for is anything growing into the center of the vase, anything we missed, anything rubbing, crowding, touching, growing dysfunctionally. This is an apricot, nice open vase, starting to bud out, well-pruned tree. That's about a 12-foot tree. Peaches and nectarines are pruned to open base shapes, but they bear on different wood than plums and apricots. They bear on last season growth. The bark is smooth and shiny, usually brown or green in color, and no fruiting spurs. This is a fruiting wood on a nectarine or peach. As they mature, these more pliable branches often are bent downward with the weight of the fruit, developing into what are known as hangers. Hangers are actually very desirable because it puts your fruit at picking height. On this tree, if we wish to keep this tree small, we can prune it down to these hangers, and now all of our fruit is down here at picking height. Keep it all down here. So we prune this here, we prune this here, we prune this here, we prune this here. And we remove the height of the tree, reducing it by 50% without making topping cuts or heading cuts. So, some before and afters. Peach tree on the left before it was pruned, after it was pruned. Removed about close to 50% of that tree. Here we see when left on this just sequences, left is unpruned, right is pruned. Here you see a tree that was topped. Can this be repaired? Yes and no. We can redefine the structure of the tree, pruning off all the excessive growth in here, trying to redevelop structural scaffolds. But will decay enter into this limb and cause structural failure? Yes. So we'll get some years out of it, but ultimately that wound is such a large wound, before it compartmentalizes, decay will hollow out that limb. Plums and apricots bear on fruiting spurs. Plum spurs on the bottom, apricot spurs on the top. Apricot spurs produce for 3 to 5 years, plums for up to 10 or more. We talked about how to identify those. So here we see a vegetative branch right up here, and fruiting spurs below. Fruiting spurs on an apricot. This is an old fruiting spur on an apricot. At this point, it's time to replace it with a young, more juvenile fruiting spur. This is reaching the end of its life. And correct pruning on a plum and apricot, unpruned left, pruned on the right. This is nice apricots. The one on the right, we pruned a modified open base that has 3 layers on that. If you don't prune your plants enough, what you're going to get is an overabundance of very small fruit that doesn't ripen properly. I know a lot of people have a hard time pruning, but what would you rather have? Bushels and bushels of tiny fruit that's poor quality, or fewer bushels of large, very high quality fruit? This is a wonderful plum. Now you can see all these suckers. These are water sprouts that grew in here. On a plum of this age, what we're removing primarily are the water sprouts, and we maintain this wonderful open vase with all the fruiting spurs along the main scaffold branches. This will be fairly quick. This is how you prune everything but the stone fruit. Your apples, your pears, your persimmons, your figs, your mulberries are pruned to central leader and modified central leader shapes. The main difference is that they keep a full center. We don't open them up into a vase. We keep a full center that protects the bark from sunburn and gives us more fruiting wood throughout the tree, so that in an open vase shape, this would all be removed. We keep it intact on everything except stone fruit. In pruning to a central leader and modified central leader shape, each branch should occupy its own space in the tree. They should not cross, they should not crowd, they should not rub, and they should not touch. Each branch grows vertically in its own area of the tree. We do need to provide adequate spacing to allow some air circulation and prevent overcrowding. One of our main goals is getting light penetration to the interior of the tree. Without adequate light penetration, all of the fruiting wood will be on the upper outside canopy of the tree. This tree, for example, which is an apple, is a mess. There is no fruiting wood on the interior of this tree. There wasn't one piece of fruit developed in here. All of our fruiting wood was way up at the top, where there was sun. Our goal in pruning this tree is not to open it up to an open vase, but to remove that excessive amount of wood so that we get some light penetrating through into the interior of this tree so that we can get good fruit wood developed. On average, central leader and modified central leader trees, we remove 20% of the wood every year, up to about 40%. However, if you're pruning well, you're only going to be managing the fruit wood primarily, perhaps some size control, so that your pruning is only removing 10 to 20% of the tree every year. Prune to a central leader shape, the tree looks like a Christmas tree with a single top. It's going to be the tallest and have the greatest amount of fruit. Prune to a modified central leader shape, the tree will develop a more rounded canopy with multiple leaders, giving the tree a broader profile but a lower height, making it easier to pick. Again, to prune to a central leader or modified central leader shape, take a step-by-step approach. First, remove your suckers. We skip opening up the center vase. There is none in this case. And our second step is to start pruning each of the scaffold limbs from the point of attachment at the trunk all the way out to the end of the limb. Remove dead, damaged, diseased, and dysfunctional branch. Remove crossing branches. Remove branches with weak crotch angles. And space out the branches so we get good light and air penetrating along the branch. Each branch will occupy its own space in the tree. If this had a branch growing across, as they often will, into this portion of the tree, it's a dysfunctional branch. We remove it. We want it to grow in its own area. Another option is we can shorten it. Starting with the lowest branch closest to the ground, from the point of attachment to the end, and then move to the next branch. When that one's done, to the next branch. That one's done, to the next branch. Again, focus on only one branch at a time. Don't try to look at the whole tree. It becomes overwhelming. As we work our way from the lowest branches around the tree, so we work on these, we then work on the branches on the interior of the tree, moving our way up into the top center of the tree. As we prune, we want the top center of the tree to be the highest point, with the outer branches descending outward and downward, giving the tree a nice rounded shape. Here we see a fig that was pruned to a nice modified central leader shape. This is about a 30-year-old fig tree that's kept at 6 feet of height and has never been topped. We don't get any suckers on it. We don't get any water sprouts on it. And we prune it about 10% every year, managing the fruiting. That's all the pruning that needs to be done. After you prune to a modified central leader shape and have worked your way around into the top center, now you stand back and look at the entire tree, just as we did before, looking for any branches you may have missed. And here you can see, and I'm just going to run you through real quickly, before and after pictures. Apple before it was pruned, after it was pruned. We're not trying to size control this tree. We're simply pruning to minimize the overcrowded branches. Before and after. This is an old apple tree that was pruned correctly. A little bit late in the season, but still, pruning late is better than not pruning at all. This is a pear that was pruned correctly for a modified central leader shape. Takes about 10% of the tree away every year. That's all we need to prune. It's the same pear. See, on this is now coming into bloom. We have fruit from ground level all the way up to the end of the branches. The whole branch is covered in fruit. Persimmons, we really have to pay close attention to the tree for structural strength. Persimmons have very brittle wood. The fruit are heavy, and they easily break branches. So one of your most important reasons for pruning, especially on persimmons, is structural strength. It's a nice little Fuyu persimmon.
Fruit tends to be born at the ends of the fruiting branches as well.
Yes.
Which tends to pull down those branches or break them.
And definitely will add additional weight load and stress to that branch. Absolutely right. Thanks, Jim. Yeah, very important. It's very depressing to go out and see a major limb just split off on your tree.
One side of that is I had trees in 2 cases that split, as you talked about. They were too heavy a load and it split right down the middle. I trimmed them, the 2 pieces, significantly, roped them back together, ran a rope all the way up, and they split clear almost to the graft union. And then just left them for a couple of years. And they came on beautifully, except the bark was corrugated where the rope was. When I took the rope off.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that heartwood never grew back together, so what's holding them together now is just a thin layer on the outside. And what you have to be really careful of is preventing it from having a heavy or too heavy of a crop, otherwise it'll do the same thing. Some figs that were pruned to modified central leaders. Pomegranates that are pruned to modified central leader, before and after. And just a quick note on dormant spraying. Whether you prune or don't prune, you should begin your dormant spraying right about Christmas time, especially on your stone fruit. We live in an area where peach leaf curl, shotball fungus, and brown rot are 3 common diseases that attack our fruit trees. Peach leaf curl, of course, on peaches and nectarines. Brown rot will attack all your fruit trees. Peach, plum, nectarine, apricot, pluots, so on. And shotball fungus, which is primarily on plums and apricots. Shotball fungus is not as significant of a problem, more cosmetic. But peach leaf curl and brown rot can be significant in damaging our crops. The most effective dormant sprays are those that are applied at least 2 to 3 times during the dormant season. You must dormant spray before first bud break. After first bud break, it's too late. So begin dormant spraying usually around Christmas time. Repeat your sprays every 2 weeks up until first bud break. Try to time it so that it's not going to rain. You have to make sure that the dormant spray stays dry for at least 24 to 48 hours after spraying. If bud break does occur, it's too late.
In what way is it too late? It's going to hurt the tree or just won't be effective?
It won't be effective. Won't be effective. The fungicides kill off the spores of the fungus before they infect the tree. Once bud break occurs, infection has already occurred.
What spray do you recommend?
Typically, if you look at the bottom, 2 sprays are normally used. A fungicide to control the fungus diseases and a oil to control the overwintering insects. Oils suffocate overwintering insects by coating their bodies and smothering them. This helps to control things like thrips and mites and scale and some caterpillar larvae. They do nothing for bark beetles or borers. No effectiveness at all. Those insects are gone. These oils, there's several of them out there. As you can see, ultrapine oils. Volk oil is often the product used as a dormant oil. And the fungicide, which helps to control the fungus diseases. Lime sulfur is extremely effective against peach leaf curl, shotball fungus, and brown rot. It smells like rotten eggs and it will discolor stucco. It's also can be very harmful if you get it in your eye. So a lot of places are no longer carrying lime sulfur. You cannot use lime sulfur on apricots, on apricot hybrids. It will cause them to abort their fruit. So great on peaches and nectarines, great on plums. Don't use it on apricots. Copper sprays are an organic, as is lime sulfur, but copper sprays can be used on everything. However, it is much less effective than lime sulfur. The best copper sprays are at least 50% tribasic copper. Not as effective as lime sulfur was, but a little more environmentally friendly. It can be used on all of your deciduous fruit trees. And if both lime sulfur and copper are organic treatments, if you don't care about being organic for your dormant spray, you can also use Daconil. Daconil is a synthetic, extremely effective. Can be used on all your fruit trees, and you can get Daconil under the Ortho Garden Disease Control. Daconil is sold under its own label. Very effective. Mix these fungicides with your oil sprays, spray them 2 to 3 times between Christmas and first bud break, and time it so it's not going to rain for at least 48 hours.
Does Daconil have any effects, bad effects
Does Daconil have any bad effects on what?
on the tree,
No,
on the fruit?
no.
On people.
All pesticides, whether they're organic or not organic, have risks associated with them. And so like a chainsaw, they're useful, but they can be dangerous. You know, your automobile is deadly. Should we all go to riding bicycles? Well, even that
How
can
about
be
a
deadly. So, you know, there are consequences. Follow the warning labels, wear the proper protection, follow directions, but for, you know, I tend to like to be organic in some cases, but with dormant sprays, I'm not insistent on it. So it's really a personal choice.
Should those sprays be alternated? Like spray one week and the other one the next week?
Alternating your sprays may be beneficial, but more important is get them in.
So even California certified organic growers can use lime salt, correct?
Yes, California certified organic gardeners can use lime sulfur or copper sprays. They cannot use Daconil. And that was a quick run through on pruning dormant trees. And so, again, this is on the website, and a little bit different than traditional methods. If you have questions anytime, feel free to give me a call. You have my phone number on your handout, I do have some business cards.